Hello, and welcome to the Turbulent World with me, James M. Dorsey, as your host. The United States had no idea that its employment in the 2000s of private military companies like Blackwater in Iraq would institutionalize and legitimize mercenaries, one of the world's oldest professions. Nor did the United States envision it would create a template for the outsourcing of the state's monopoly on violence, that countries such as Russia, Turkey, China, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates would adapt, often with devastating consequences. Even so, U.S. President Donald Trump took conceptualizing military force as a commodity rather than a tool of defense and statecraft to an extreme in 2019, when he made retaliation for Yemeni Houthi rebel attacks on Saudi oil installations contingent on the kingdom paying for the service. Today, one just has to switch on the news to realize that mercenaries and private military companies live a life of their own and shape headlines. Chaos and mayhem dominate the streets of Haiti after Colombian mercenaries killed the president. Russia's Wagner Group played a key role in the invasion of Ukraine, and at one point appeared to revolt against President Vladimir Putin. This is just to name a few recent history-shaping events. My guest, Alessandro Arduino, one of the world's foremost experts and author of a recently published book, Money for Mayhem: Mercenaries, Private Military Companies, Drones, and the Future of War, cautions that outstanding violence opens the door to what he calls private wars. Haiti is a prime example. The irony is that the latest phase in the evolution of mercenaries and private military entities first emerged in the Middle East, a region racked by wars and conflict, in which states like the United States, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Turkey backed armed-to-the-teeth non-state actors of different stripes. These actors range from private military companies to ideologically driven militias to rebels who, in some cases like Syria, created their own commercial mercenary enterprises. With massive investments across the globe, and particularly in the greater Middle East, that stretches from the Chinese border into Eastern Africa, in which Chinese personnel and assets are targets for the likes of Baloch nationalists and Islamist militants in Pakistan, China has created the world's largest domestic private security force, populated by commercial companies. Increasingly, those companies are flexing their muscles in the protection of Chinese investments along the People's Republic's massive Belt and Road Initiative. Research into this latest phase in the history of guns for hire is in its infancy. Alessandro Arduino, or simply Alex, is one of its foremost midwives. Alex, congratulations on your latest book. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
James, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start on a personal note. Private military has been a key focus of yours over the many years that we have known each other. What initially sparked your fascination with the evolution of China's private military industry, and then with the industry more globally?
Let's say, James, that it started with a very tiny research, not even for a paper. It was an article. And at the time, China, it was moving its first step in protecting the Belt and Road Initiative. So I just had one question into my mind. Is China going to have a Chinese Blackwater company? Meaning, is the Chinese state going to localize private asset all over the world on Chinese private company to protect its investment? And the answer at the beginning was quite straightforward from the military industry complex in China, and it was a no. The state is going to protect the investment. But then I realized that already on the oil and energy side, several Chinese state-owned enterprises were employing foreign private military company and private security company to protect their asset, and it slowly percolated to what is now the growth and the rise of the Chinese private security sector.
In my mind, this latest phase in the evolution of mercenaries and private military companies starts with a significant presence in Iraq of military contractors during the U.S.-led invasion in 2003. These contractors were symbolized by Blackwater, headed by Eric Prince, one of the industry's leading and most controversial figures. What was the thinking behind the outsourcing of tasks to contractors, and in what way did this create a template for others?
As you correctly point out, James, the Middle East, it's the area in which we can trace the evolution of the private military security sector, and especially now how other actors, namely China, Russia, and Turkey, are moving away from the corporate path that the US traced in the last 20 years. At the time, in order to protect the Ministry of Foreign Affairs personnel, state personnel, and security installation, and also to augment training and capabilities of the army, there was a growing market for force. And the main driver was basically related to the assumption that was topical during the Reagan and the Thatcher era, that the private sector is better than the private sector. Meaning private military companies are more efficient, cost-efficient, effective, and produce better results than just the army, or in conjunction with the army. And it was the idea behind the outsourcing. And it, of course, for the US, it worked well. It didn't have to go back to draft more able young men to be part of the conflict, and of course outsource a lot of service that are not related to kinetic service. Let me be more clear. When a modern army go to war, there is the necessity for a lot of support in the back line, meaning you need cook, you need people delivering mail, you need people washing dishes and uniform, and so on. So the private sector was able to provide third country national that were doing this kind of job without involving military personnel. And of course, this kind of service evolved even to include kinetic service. So at the time of the war in Iraq and after, even in Afghanistan, an important part of this duty were done by contractors. We can see in the history of US warfare that with the war in the former Yugoslavia, then in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the ratio of military and contractor increased almost exponentially. In Afghanistan, you have 1.5 contractor for each military man deployed there. So this trend was also highlighted by a crisis, the one that you mentioned before, Blackwater. Blackwater contractors in Baghdad, at Nisour Square, opened fire, killing 17 innocent Iraqi civilians. And that was a topical moment when the West started to ask if outsourcing the state-private monopoly of violence was the right thing. One answer to that crisis was the establishment of the Montreux Code of Conduct and how to regulate the private military and security sector. But now, again, if we look at the Middle East as a focus, as a topical area, we see that China and Russia learned from the US/Blackwater lesson, developing their own private security in the case of China, private military/mercenary and quasi-private military, or even better, armed militia in the case of Russia. So we can see this transformation in the Middle East, in which, for example, the Wagner Group, that is now basically the flavor of the month in discussing mercenarism from Ukraine to Africa, started its first step in Syria. And then we can see in other areas in the Middle East when there are not only private military company, legally registered and law-abiding private military company, but a rise in group of unaccountable private military, rogue private military, and even mercenaries. Unfortunately, nowadays, the gray area that surround the definition of private military company, private security company, and mercenaries is increasing. And is being exploited by states that use this quite loose definition to basically being legally unaccountable while using mercenary to do their bidding.
This raises two questions. One is, should the incident in Baghdad not have raised a red flag? And second of all, it's not clear to me what the lesson learned is beyond the fact that they've established their own private military entities. I mean, there's no guarantee that those private military entities would not have incidents like you mentioned in Baghdad in 2007 with Blackwater. In fact, we know, certainly with the Wagner Group, that those incidents are multiple.
In this respect, the problem is related to several overlapping national and international law. If someone commits a crime in a country, there is that country law that applies. But when we are talking about PMC, if they are under a code of conduct or regulation of the military, is one case, and you have to see if these operate in an area that is basically without law. And the second part is related to the fact that also mercenary organizations are used just for this, because plausible deniability is one of their biggest assets. They are employed by country, and when something horrendous, horrific, like killing of an innocent civilian happen, a country that can just use plausible deniability, saying they are independent private operator and they have nothing to do, even if they are national from that country, as the case of Wagner in multiple time. But again, if we are looking at the broader sphere of the state privatization of the monopoly of violence, there are different trends and there are different needs. So we don't need to put everything in one basket. For example, if we look at the US model, the Western model, basically the state privatization of the monopoly of force is being efficient, economical, and especially when states are not inclined to send their own kids into a war zone. Then if we move to other area, still staying in the Middle East, to the Gulf, for example, in this area, there are very wealthy countries like the Gulf country that don't have the necessary manpower to wage war or to defend themselves, so they use private soldier, contracted soldier. Then we move to China, as you mentioned before, the necessity to protect the Belt and Road Initiative, sending private security to protect Chinese personnel all over the world. And finally, you have the Russian hiding military force in plain sight, saying that is nothing to do with Russia. I remember when at the United Nations, Foreign Affairs Minister Lavrov was asked why they send military force in Mali, and his answer was very straightforward. It's a private matter, it's a private military company, and the Malian government is discussing with this company. Irony to that is that PMC are illegal according to the Russian law.
PMC being private military companies.
Correct.
I mean, sorry to belabor this, but it strikes me that the major lesson learned then is plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability is one of the lessons. Now it will be, for example, for Russia more difficult since the demise of Mr. Prigozhin to claim plausible deniability, when Russia just mentioned that all the Wagner force, especially the one positioned in very lucrative area, mining area in Africa and the Middle East, are related and directly controlled by the Ministry of Defense of State Security. But then the problem is not only plausible deniability, is when atrocities are being committed, how to find the culprit and how to bring them to justice. This is a huge problem because the law against mercenarism is quite old. It's a 1949 law that look at mercenarism, at individuals, not as a group. And basically it was done as a reminiscence of the atrocity committed by mercenaries during the Africa post-colonial war. Then there was an update in 1999 in the crime of recruiting mercenary. But then again, if we look at UN level, there has been more than 100 discussions on how to arrest and to find mercenaries, but then it's very difficult from a legal point of view. Let me explain. In a nation, in a country that is ravaged by war, it's very difficult per se to have some kind of law that make the country police able to arrest this person. And then just try to go with the police force to arrest someone that is heavily armed and then can shoot back. So one problem is that mercenaries are on the rise. So one takeout from my book, Money for Mayhem, is that basically mercenaries are back and are here to stay. And mercenaries prosper in preserving mayhem, uncertainty, and instability. So they don't have any, let's say, inclination to change their pattern. Again, let me be more specific. In areas from the Middle East that are rich of oil and gas, in other areas in Africa that are rich in diamond, copper, and gold, mercenaries are paid to protect local government and related entities. But if there is stability, if there is peace, they are out of the job. So it's in their own interest, as it happened for 1,000 years, for all mercenary groups to keep preserving uncertainty and instability.
Let's stick for a moment with Wagner, because Wagner really was, after the Americans in Iraq, the next major mercenary entity to appear on the international stage. And the question is there a comparison between with Blackwater, as well as other private military companies in Iraq, and the emergence of the Wagner Group in Syria in 2015, when Russian forces came to the aid of embattled President Bashar al-Assad during the civil war?
In this respect, first and foremost, American private military company are registered entity, registered company, mostly in the United States, and they abide by certification and some certain code of conduct. So if something bad happens, there is accountability and the responsibility. Then definitely, if we are looking at the massacre in Nisour Square, it took more than 7 years to put the culprit in jail, but it didn't have, it happened.
This is the square in Baghdad where the 17 people were killed.
Correct. It happened. They were on trial. It was not an easy trial. It was very difficult to prove manslaughter, but at the end, they ended up in prison. They didn't last long in prison, I have to say, because they were pardoned by the, at the time, president, who was Donald Trump. But without saying that, Blackwater was rebranded into XC, into Academy, resold, and now it's part of a bigger conglomerate of PMC and security provider that is the Constellis Group. Then if we move in what Russia learned out of the Blackwater experience, and we can see in Syria, the first step of what became the Wagner playbook, meaning when Russia need to expand its geoeconomical influence and security interested, is doing it below the radar, sending military trainer. Most of these military trainers at the time in Syria were part of the Slavonica Corps, that was the name before the Wagner Group, and part of the people from Slavonica moved out of the group and founded, with the support of a businessman, criminal businessman, Mr. Prigozhin, founded Wagner Group. One of the leading figures moving from Slavonica to Wagner Group is Dmitry Utkin, that he perished in a plane accident that Mr. Prigozhin had not long ago on flight to St. Petersburg. Having said that, what is the Wagner playbook? Basically, small number, 100, 150, 200 trainers arriving in country. That was the case in Syria. Everybody knows that they are Russian. Most of the time, they are moved with Russian military planes and Russian military logistics, but they claim to be a private military company. So nothing to do with the Russian state. After they take place, they also are supported by the Internet Research Agency, who is a St. Petersburg registered troll factory, that use media propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation to promote the Russian view that Russian PMC and Russian contractors are a force for good. At the same time, they increase their local operation, and when the operation are stabilized, meaning control of oil asset, control of land, then finally the Russian army can jump in and claim the day. It started in Syria. It moved the same modus operandi, the same playbook to Libya, but Libya is quite a particular case because like in the Middle Age, you have mercenary against mercenary from one side to the other of the conflict, but where the Wagner playbook worked extremely well for Mother Russia is in Africa, in sub-Saharan Sahel. Same playbook played in Syria. Military trainer, let me give you the example of Central African Republic. The president was besieged by rebel. Then at the time, the French-led Barkhane operation, counter-terrorism operation, was not showing result. The president was feeling under siege by several insurgent forces in the country, and he basically was just by himself in Bangui, in the capital. Russian trainer arrived, 150, with military plane from Russia. After that, they started to expand in numbers, reaching the 1,000, and they start to have training the local presidential guard and also have operation on the ground, expanding the control of the presidential force in the territory. There are allegedly numerous war crimes that have been committed, killing of innocent civilians, even entire village being erased, but I have to say allegedly because up to now we still have to have this confirmation of this mass murder, mass rape, and so on committed by the Wagner group. But I will say that that modus operandi worked because at the same time Russia expanded its geopolitical control and in compensation for the service received part of the diamond and the gold coming from the very lucrative mining industry in the area. And then if you move this playbook in other countries, from Burkina Faso, from Mali, CAR, and then the next one could be, for example, Niger or even Chad, that's the area in which the Wagner plausible deniability worked until Prigozhin demise.
It seems to me that the lines between private military companies and rebel forces offering mercenary services are blurred at times. Two interconnected regions where this is the case are the Horn of Africa and North Africa. Libyan rebel commander Khalifa Haftar has allowed military bases under his control to be used for weapons shipments to the rebel Rapid Support Force in Sudan, headed by Mohammed Hamad Dagalo, better known as Hemeti. At the same time, the UAE, Haftar, and Wagner partnered with Hemeti on lucrative gold smuggling and illicit mining operations in Sudan. What does this tell us?
This definitely is a trend, and mercenary has not to look at mercenary group as in a vacuum. They are part of a broader network. So as you correctly mentioned, while the Wagner group was and is still deployed in Libya, fighting in support of Khalifa Haftar, there is an important rising in relationship with other mercenary groups that have been fighting before as mercenary in Libya. Now we call the RSF with this fancy name, but we don't have to forget the name they were called before. Yes, that is Janjaweed. Janjaweed were operating already in Libya at the time of Muammar Gaddafi as a mercenary. Libya at the time was a host of different set of mercenary. If I recall correctly, Gaddafi was even using Serbian sniper in his forces.
And then after for a minute, the Janjaweed were essentially the government-backed forces in Darfur during the major crisis in Darfur.
Correct. And the link forged in Libya between the Wagner group and RSF helped Wagner to move, for example, into Sudan in 2017, if I recall correct, in support of at the time President Omar al-Bashir, that used the RSF as his personal praetorian. And then now, during the ongoing civil war, there are inkling that there is an important link between Wagner and RSF in terms of weapons smuggling and augmenting the capability about RSF. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this mercenary modus operandi that we saw in the last 1,000 years in increasing insecurity, increasing instability is also there. Wagner have no necessity to see a peaceful resolution of the civil war in Sudan, for example. The more the war goes on, the more they can support the instability, the more they can gain from local mining operation, and also looking at Russia's long-term geopolitical objectives that are port. For example, port of Sudan is extremely important for Russia, as the case, for example, if we shift back to Libya, the port on the Mediterranean Sea, and also the control of a very important intangible asset that is the tap valve on migration. Libya is one of the areas that is mostly used for migrants to move into Europe, and then controlling the coastal area with the mercenary force is also a very important geopolitical leverage that Moscow can use via the Wagner Group. So again, let me summarize the case from Sudan to Libya and so on. Is mercenary, as it happened in the past, can ignite conflict. They are essential in creating and preserving instability. They also, where they operate, promote corruption and accountability. They use already the very limited resource of the state for their own end. So it's money coming from the sale of diamond, gold, and oil that could have been used to develop the country for school, for hospital, for finding proper job. And then at the end, there is also a part that is not much researched, is the fact that still mercenary need more mercenary. So when they arrive in country, they tend to absorb, to poach talent from that country, meaning police force and skilled military special force that, irony, most of the time were trained with trainer from the West and with money from the West. So in a nutshell, mercenaries that operate in all this area create a huge problem for the nation state, and they promote state instability.
And they, of course, attract national police and special forces personnel and so forth because they offer more money.
Absolutely. At the end, the golden rule for mercenary is getting money and getting paid on time. When I was researching for my book, Money for Mayhem, I interviewed a lot of private military contractors, mercenary. I even spoke with people that were related to Wagner, and they were saying that among the world on PMC and quasi-PMC in Russia, Prigozhin was well respected because he was paying in cash and on time. And if someone was getting maimed, disabled, or even they're killed, there was a compensation always paid to the family. So this is quite important if we look from the individual, the mercenary. Then we have to ask the question, why someone won't be a mercenary? That again, it's a very 1,000 years old question, and we have different group of people. You can have most of the time former special force or former combat veteran that have issue in finding a proper way, a proper work in the civilian life. So they perpetuate the cycle of violence. Then you have a tiny part, but it's still a component of psychopath, people who really enjoy doing that kind of work. And then, unfortunately, there is a rising trend that, in my opinion, is very disconcerting, is the fact that there is a kind of modern slavery. Individuals that are forced in being mercenary, and or individuals who have given limited choice. We see in Ukraine, for example, Russian prisoner given the choice to stay in prison, where most of the time, if they are not protected by the local inmates, they end up being raped, or going to die in Bakhmut. And if someone chooses to die in the Russian war of invasion of Ukraine, looking at the possibility of staying in prison, you can see what kind of life they are having in the Russian prison system. So these basically are the trend in the cycle of violence and in cycle of recruitment. And we don't have to forget when conflict are going to end, Ukraine will end sometime in the future, you are going to have thousands of young soldiers that have grown up their basically adult life fighting a war. And they are going to be the preferred recruit for the next cycle of new mercenary. And it's something that we really need to look at right now. For example, who were the first to get recruited by Wagner were veterans from the Chechen War. Before Wagner Group, there was other outfits that were fighting a kind of mercenary war for Mother Russia, and the recruits were so-called Afghansky, the ones who were so scared by the experience in Afghanistan that they choose to go on in this kind of line of work.
I want to come back to something that you said earlier about Libya and ask you to expand. You said Libya was different from the other, basically from the playbook of Wagner in Syria and elsewhere in Africa, because Libya was a situation in which, you called it medieval, in which mercenaries were pit against mercenaries. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, and that Libya definitely for Wagner contractors like Ukraine is not a place of their choice of operation. If you look at the age group in Africa, for example, most of the Wagner contractors are above 30 years old, meaning they are former special forces coming from Spetsnaz, GRU, and so on, and they find a very lucrative way to employ their skill. Africa is the perfect environment for the return of mercenary, meaning fragile state, a lot of natural resource prone for grabbing, chance to making good money for this individual, and at the same time, the conflict are low-level conflict. Friction is very limited. Libya is not the case. It's a war. And in one side, you have the Wagner Group improving, augmenting the capability of Khalifa Haftar army. And on the other side, the support of Turkey, supporting the GNA. And in this case, you have new kind...
The nationally recognized government of Libya.
Correct. And for the first time in modern era, you have two lines of mercenary fighting one against the other. Then it was very common in Europe during the medieval time, but also in other areas of the world. We don't have to forget that in Europe during the time of Westphalia, we start to think that mercenary is evil, is a bad thing, while dying for your flag and not dying for the coin is the right thing to do. But in other parts of the world, mercenaries never disappeared. In Africa, we are talking about post-colonial war with executive outcome, Sandline. Then we can move to other areas like China, where in 1911 you had warlords that were employing mercenaries coming from all over the world. And this is a trend. So as we've seen right now, there was a United Nations, I think, a publication not long ago that was saying that the biggest impediment in Libya in finding a solution between the two warring parties is the role of mercenary. And they advised both parties to get rid of mercenary. And as I said before, mercenary preserve their status, their income with instability. If there is peace, they are out of the job. So basically, if they win the battle, they get themselves out of a job. If they lose the battle, they die or they end up in prison. So they need to preserve constantly this state of unaccountability and instability. And that's the case of Libya.
Syria is important in this discussion, not just because of the role of Wagner, but also because it produced the world's first jihadist private military company, Malhama Tactical, or what some call Islam's Blackwater. Tell us more about Malhama Tactical, its impact, commercial viability, and whether the fact that Uyghur militants play an important role in the company is significant.
Yeah, the case of Malhama Tactical is quite interesting when I was researching the overall outfit of Mercenary, because one distinct character of Mercenaries all over is the fact that they are looking at the coin, at getting money at the end of the month, and they were not driven by ideology. This case is different because Malhama Tactical was and is still now in very limited capability an Al-Qaeda affiliate private military outfit, as they call themselves, that was working in Syria, mainly operating in the Syrian city of Idlib for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or better known as HTS. It's pro-Al-Qaeda terrorist group. They, according to the website, because they had a website in promoting their activity, they were extremely active on social media, on YouTube, on Facebook, they labeled themselves a private military company, meaning they were offering a kind of service in training jihadists in Syria to fight Bashar al-Assad and Russian forces. And basically their motto was to improve the combat capability, but not to forge Ingimazi, so the suicide fighter. And in this respect, it was quite strange because there is this link about private military and ideology. And at the same time, this link was the biggest problem for them, because other several militant organizations in the area affiliated to Al-Qaeda called them as not a rightful Muslim force because they were doing it for money. And then it was a perversion of Islam. And in this respect, there's been a lot of discussion online on the real effective role of Malhama Tactical. And then at the end, especially when the leader and the founder, Abu Rafiq, was killed during a Russian bombardment with the new leader, Al-Shishani, the group moved to a normal, let's say, jihadist outfit without claiming to be the Blackwater of jihad.
We find a similar sort of link between ideology and commerce, not only in Malhama Tactical, but at least in some of the Turkish companies like Sadat, which appear to be inspired by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's mix of religion and Turkish nationalism. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, that's correct. Again, you don't need much of intelligence on any other thing. You just go on the website of Sadat Defense Group, the company, and they mention on their website that they are a defense security company that is providing training and military training for all the Muslim countries. So it worked very well with the vision of the Turkish President Recep Erdogan of neo-Ottomanism. So we have a company that have the romantic view of the Ottoman Empire, and we don't have to forget that the army, the Ottoman army from the 15th century to the 17th century was extremely skillful in using and deploying mercenaries. Most of the time, people think about the Janissar, but it's not the case. Janissar were not mercenary. They were inside the chain of command of the Ottoman army. So it's like saying that Wagner is a private company. Wagner is not registered, is not a private company. But then at the time, the Ottoman army was using specialized mercenary for different tasks. If I recall correct, the Okaban, for example, were some sort of combat engineer that they were following the Ottoman army, building bridges and roads. And then you have the Ottoman artillery that was basically built by Hungarian or by Italian. That was the kind of mercenary that they were using. So we can see now Turkish private military company are a new arrival, a new kid on the block in terms of the evolution of PMC, and Sadat is spearheading this evolution. It was founded in 2016, I think, by former retired Brigadier General Tanri Verdi, who was a security advisor of President Erdogan. And then you can see a link now with Prigozhin and Utkin be very near to Putin, until it wasn't, and with strongman in Turkey being near to this new private military company. Then there is a lot of discussion going on now, especially from researchers from the UAE and Israel, pointing the finger at Sadat as the link in between the use of Syrian mercenary in area from Nagorno-Karabakh to Libya, but we have to say allegedly, because Sadat strongly denied this fact. But we can see that there is an evolution, and we are very far now from the path traced by the United States in economic and efficient. Its ideology, its policy, and its authoritarian state that have a close link with this tool of geopolitical expansion, but at the same time of plausible deniability. So if we look specifically at Turkey, it's something that is really important to look at the future trend. But for example, Turkish police in terms of international trading is extremely well known and well respected. They are in Somalia now, in Mogadishu airport. They had been advising during the FIFA World Cup in Qatar and so on. But then now you have this line, the gray area, getting more blurred. If you are going to have this service as a private security, this service as a military augmenting, or at the end having involvement with mercenary outfit. One thing that is important to say is that the evolution, for example, Sadat, it's a tool of Turkish foreign policy that is neither pro-Ukrainian, neither pro-Russian, is essentially pro-Turkish.
Contrary to Wagner, Sadat isn't really a household name. How important is Sadat on the international stage compared to, for example, the successor companies, a company to Blackwater or Wagner itself?
I think it's important to chart the rise of private military company that have an ideological background, a very strong ideological background, and essentially is important because it's still operating in several areas of the world, hot area, flashpoint, and being able to fly below the radar. The fact that there is not much fuss or talk about Turkish private military company is quite important, because US private military company become famous or infamous after the accident, after the killing, the tragedy of Nisour Square by Blackwater. Wagner again became famous long after it started to operate because of its atrocity, but more important, it became the flavor of the month after Mr. Prigozhin U-turn against Putin. And that was quite surprising for me. Not that he did that, because that's the way for 1,000 years mercenaries have been renegotiating their pay. When they are in arm, when you are defending the Roman Empire and the mercenary are at the gate, that's the time when the mercenary look at the emperor and just say, that's time to renegotiate our pay. And in my opinion, what Prigozhin did was basically a renegotiation of what he could gain out of that. Of course, he didn't play the end properly, and we all saw that when it happened to his kind of aborted vertical landing, or I don't know how you want to call it, what it happened to his airplane in mid-flight. But I will say that we have to see one thing. Everyone was surprised at the time, and that shocked me because everyone was surprised. And why I say so? Because if we look at history, for 1,000 years, very successful mercenary group have only one option: becoming the king, or basically getting killed by the king. And I think for the history of Prigozhin, we already know the answer.
Just for the benefit of our listeners and the viewers, Prigozhin, the head of and the founder of Wagner, essentially turned on Vladimir Putin, marched on Moscow, and then was later that led to Wagner coming under the control, full official control of the Russian government, and ultimately to the death of Prigozhin and his number two, in a plane crash en route from Moscow to St. Petersburg. Just so that everybody knows what we're talking about here. Coming back to something else that you said earlier, Iraq was not just the fulcrum for American private military companies, but also for the venturing abroad of Chinese entities seeking to secure Chinese assets. Talk to us about the significance of overseas operations of Chinese private military companies, where and how they operate, and how they compare to their U.S. counterparts.
Yes, even before the start of presidency flagship foreign policy initiative, the Belt and Road, Chinese private security company started to venture abroad, protecting oil field in Iraq. At the time, as it happened now, most of this company have a security manager, meaning people that are in between the Chinese engineer, the Chinese worker, the Chinese infrastructure, and local armed militia, contractor, or international armed PMC that work for China. At the time, for example, of Iraq, Chinese entity were located in safer area in the south, and they were protected by Western forces, mostly controlled by control risk group from United Kingdom. The situation has evolved. Chinese private security are augmenting their capabilities, but still there is quite a mismatch in what they think they are capable and what they can deliver. If we look at the market structure in China, private security is extremely well regulated since 1993. The law has been updated in 2009, and there is going probably in few months a new law that detail every very little issue that the private security can encounter. It's very difficult for a private security in China to be armed. There isn't the necessity. And also when moving outside China, most of the time they are unarmed and they contract locally armed force and personnel. I say mostly because there are some Chinese private security companies that offer armed service in international water against pirate and against threat in sea lane of communication. And we can see now with the issue of the Houthi threatening sea lane of communication near the Strait of Bab al-Mandeb. This is a current quite big issue that has been discussed in China. But getting back to the Belt and Road Initiative, China still abide by the decade-old principle of non-interference. Meaning if a crisis erupts at international level, China is not willing, and in some respect not able, to send the People Liberation Army to protect its interests. Chinese People Liberation Army Navy has been increasingly getting better in blue water operation, very far from the land. So we can see when Muammar Gaddafi regime collapsed in Libya, they were able to evacuate more than 30,000 Chinese workers. But then again, we are not seeing PLA boot on the ground. That's the case. There is a vacuum, and this vacuum is increasingly filled by Chinese private security company. So these companies are protecting Chinese investment and Chinese personnel against criminal violence, terrorism, or just act against just basically theft against Chinese property all over. But then there is a rise, and as you, James, mentioned correctly, in several areas, especially in Pakistan, if we look at Balochistan. China invested in that area $63 billion in the CPEC, the Sino-China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and there is an increase of terrorist violence against Chinese workers because China, Beijing, is perceived as an ally of Islamabad, and then the insurgent want to punish China for supporting Punjabi in their area. Having said that, we don't have also to forget that since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, now China become the enemy number one for the Islamic State in Khorasan. And then again, there is this fear of increasing security moving from Afghanistan to Pakistan to all Central Asia. And that's where China is looking at an increased, more capable role for its own private security company. But then again, Chinese private security company at home are from 7,000 to 10,000 outfit registered and working in mainland China. And if you move this huge number to the one operating With good capabilities outside China, we are talking about 20 and no more of companies that are very professional and operating outside China. There has been some discussion about Chinese private security, but most of the time this discussion look at China trying to picture Chinese PSC as the Blackwater or now as the Wagner Group. So in my personal opinion, Chinese private security companies are not the Blackwater and not the Wagner Group. Definitely both groups tried to work with the Chinese. Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, even opened shop in Hong Kong. The company is called FSG, Frontier Service Group, and the business partner of Mr. Prince is CITIC Group. CITIC Group is one of China's state oldest economic financial juggernaut. And then if you have that as a partner, you know very well with who you are working with. And then at the same time, during the Trump administration, when there was an increase of friction between China and the United States, Chinese private security company, and most important, their client, the state-owned enterprises, they were feeling insecure in contracting to Western private security or private military company. And then it was the time for several Russian company, private security and even quasi-PMC, so I mean in Russian PMC registered outside Russia, to pitch their service to the Chinese, because at the time there was this perception that the Belt and Road security is a huge market. There is a lot of money to be made. It was not the case, but there is still some idea. So basically, to summarize the Russian offer, they had 3 points. First point, they are not going to tell SOEs, state-owned enterprises, secret to the West. The second point, that it works extremely well in the Chinese market, and they say they are efficient, but they are very economical in respect to their Western counterpart. And the last one is the fact that they underline experienced contractor with battle capabilities, meaning you can tell them where to go and they are going there shooting. There is something that still in the masculinity of the Chinese private security sector worked very well, and it worked for Blackwater too. We don't have to forget that the last time that China fought a war was in 1979, if I correct, against Vietnam. So it's been really a long time since there was a conflict, and there are basically no veterans in the army. So most of the PSC are composed by former PLA, People Liberation Army Special Forces soldier, policemen, or even People Armed Police, the PAP, but not many of them have been seen real combat zone. So this masculinity coming out of Blackwater or even the Wagner Group had some echo in Beijing.
If I may, I want to switch gears for a moment. Technology is changing the landscape of mercenaries and private military companies, particularly with the emergence of mercenaries in the cyberspace. Beyond the threat this poses to a country's critical infrastructure, does this also elevate the significance of information wars alongside wars fought on the battlefield?
In this respect, when I was working on my book, the role of cybersecurity and drone were my big question about what next. What is the future of mercenaries? And definitely technology is already playing, not is going to play, it's already right now playing a very important role. There is a huge problem in cyber mercenaries, finding who is a cyber mercenary. Up to now, as I mentioned earlier, since 1949, from a legal standpoint, it's already very difficult to point the finger at someone who is a mercenary. That mostly the law say is a foreign national that is taking part of a conflict, getting paid for that, but is not part of one of the army that is waging war. Then the problem is that if we go to the cyber realm, to the cyberspace, it's very easy for cyber mercenary to cloak themselves just saying that legally it's a software company, is a software security company, or even just disappear under aliases in the dark web. So the first and foremost problem in looking at cyber mercenarism is the definition. is something that in the book I've been trying to address, looking at the United Nations Work Group on Mercenary that is currently working on the issue of cyber mercenary. But why cyber mercenary is very important? Because hacking as a service is a very fluid area in a very poorly regulated at international level industry, but is very profitable. So we have all the component of a mercenary world, meaning there is a lot of money to be made, there is not much of accountability, it's not easy to get caught by the police, and even if they get you, it's difficult to get indicted. So it's a perfect storm, just waiting to unleash. There are issues now addressing this fact. For example, if you look at Project Mayhem in the UAE, there was some former intelligence officers specialized in hacking who were contracted. So the question is, they were cyber mercenary or not? Or if you look at the use of spyware and malware for companies that sell this service to state and to legitimate police force, but when this software, this app move into the gray zone and then is received by criminal organization or is used and abused against civilian, against journalists and so on, that's the case to start to ask question if we consider this company cyber mercenary or not. And as I mentioned before, is a perfect storm. All the component of boots on the ground mercenaries is already there, and we are just waiting to see what's the worst coming out from this.
You also talk in your book about the booming emergence of drone mercenaries and competition between China and Turkey and possibly Iran for dominance in the global market for combat drones. What do you mean by drone mercenaries, and how is this competition shaping up?
Yeah, the competition for the market share is between China and Turkey. For market share or armed UAV, unmanned aerial vehicles, or better known as combat drones. In this respect, I was attempting in my book Money for Mayhem to look at the what next. So in my personal opinion, as we have mercenary that have hacking capability, mercenary that have information and disinformation capability, the next logical step is to have mercenary group that have combat drone for hire, underwater drone or terrestrial drone for hire, meaning that you can have a military force on the ground, but also that a country, a warlord, a dictator can rent an air force for hire. And that's the next logical step. But up to now, normally when people think about the market for combat drone, what it comes to mind are the US Reaper and this kind of very high level, very expensive and sophisticated drone. But in reality, the infight to reach the top of the sale worldwide for this kind of drone is between China and Turkey. Why? Essentially, as I just mentioned, the US has probably the best drone on the market, but is the kind of Rolls Royce of the drone, meaning is expensive and is not for everybody. US is not willing to sell drone to a lot of countries, even countries that are allied to the US, while China and Turkey don't have this kind of call. They sell drone to a lot of different countries. China started first with economic affordable drone that can deliver. And for example, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia acquired an entire drone production line. But then after the 44 days war in Nagorno-Karabakh, with basically the Turkish drone Bayraktar TB42 showcasing how in matter of weeks they can defeat the entire line of armored truck, main battle tanks and so on, Turkish drone become the darling of the combat drone world. And even President Erdogan was used to say that every time he moved to a foreign land, the first thing they ask him is, can I buy your Turkish drone? So this trend is ongoing. Turkey is having an upper hand in selling drone. But then, as you said before, James, Iran is getting into the fray, supplying allegedly drone to Russia. And this underlines a trend in terms of quality versus quantity. Shahel drones are very low-level drone compared to the American one, or even with the Chinese Taikon or the Bayraktar, but are easy to assemble, are cheap, they get the work done, and they can overwhelm, as unfortunately we saw in Ukraine, aerial defense. So they are economic efficient. And I recall there was an economic paper by a defense paper by a scholar from the Royal United Service Institute that he mentioned that there was no surprise in seeing arms transfer between Iran and Russia. But the surprise is the direction of the vector, that is from Tehran going to Moscow, what nobody was kind of looking at. So we are seeing that this kind of situation, when quantity over quality is getting better in the world of arm, we are going also to witness a rise of mercenaries that are going to have better disinformation and propaganda capability, better armament in terms of drones, because drones are getting ubiquitous and they're getting cheaper.
Alex, time is not our friend. Even so, this has been a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope so has our audience. Thank you for joining me on the show, and thanks to our listeners and viewers. Please share any comments or questions you may have in the comment section of this podcast on Substack, and please stay tuned for my twice-weekly episodes. Best wishes, take care, and see you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed today's column and podcast. The Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey depends on the support of its readers. For the past 12 years, I have maintained free distribution as a way of maximizing impact. I am determined to keep it that way. However, to avoid putting up a paywall, I need the support of a core of voluntary paid subscribers to cover the cost of producing the column and podcast. If you believe that the column and podcast add value to your understanding and that of the broader public, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. You can do so by clicking on Substack on the subscription button at www.jamesmdorsey.substack.com and choosing one of the subscription options. Thank you, take care, and best wishes.